to us and outline a strategy for establishing reproductive rights for all. So thank you, Sol.
That sounds much more impressive.
Take all my paraphernalia here.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this presentation that is provocatively titled "The Loss of Roe v. Wade, an Unnecessary Fear." What I hope to do by the end of this is kind of allay some of your anxieties about what's going on and what may happen with the courts. So to start out, it must be stated that Roe v. Wade was not a revolutionary advancement in women's rights as it is sold. And it certainly doesn't allow women the ability to extinguish the life of unborn babies with impunity. Roe v. Wade was a compromise. It's problematic law, very problematic law, but for the time, a decent compromise. Now, what we need to understand as the reason for such laws and why it should not be codified into federal law, and to shape some strategies to address some of the concerns coming from what's going on, we need to go back to the beginning. 1789, the original Constitution was ratified. Now, it was, to get to that point, the framers had to have a massive compromise. And that was slavery. What was necessary, however, to get to that point was the document needed to be shaped where the people's rights could be bypassed. So, using vagaries, euphemisms, educated ambiguous prose, and an institution of interpretation, a document was structured that allowed the rights of the people in the Constitution to be worked around, if not completely ignored. What this meant is that Black and Indigenous people had no rights to speak of. Non-European immigrants, well, their rights were flexible depending on their location. Women pretty much the same, but their rights were generally attached to and certainly subservient to the rights of men. Now, this showed that working around the Constitution was not only possible, but was actually acceptable. And this attitude would continue for 75 years until after the Civil War, when these strategies would be sharpened. 1865 to 1870 would see an addition to the Constitution of the first Human Rights Amendment since its original ratification. And that would be these. There they are, the Reconstruction Amendments. 13th Amendment banning slavery in this country. 14th Amendment establishes equal protections under the law, due process, and birthright citizenship. 15th Amendment ensures voting rights. Ostensibly created to protect the rights of the newly freed slaves, every one of these amendments would be worked around. The 13th Amendment was crafted with the stipulation that the federal government would not interfere with how Southern states handled its newly freed slaves. Now, while it does ban slavery, there's an exception: prisons. And the states wasted no time in using that loophole. 14th Amendment, well, the abuse of slaves, because of the 13th Amendment, made the 14th and 15th Amendment necessary. 14th Amendment was, through several different court rulings, was pretty much became advisory. And the 15th Amendment, well, it was subject to all kinds of obstruction. Yes.
Mr. Gibson, I'm so sorry. Is your mic on?
I think so.
Yeah, it looks like it's on. The blue light's on.
The blue light's on.
Yeah.
Is there a volume on the mic?
There shouldn't be.
We'll see. Testing, testing.
It looks like it's working. I don't.
Yeah, it looks like it should be. Say something again, please.
Hi, how you doing?
Yeah, it's coming. That's better. Yeah, sorry.
Well, I was actually talking about the mic for the
Oh, the other mic.
Check, check, check.
other audience.
Yeah, it's showing red. Not sure what that means. Let's try this other one. Green is good, red is, I don't know. There we go.
Hello. Is that working for everyone?
I hope so.
This one may have a dead battery.
Okay, well, while you inspect that, I shall continue.
Go ahead.
Now, as I said, the 14th Amendment through several court rulings was rendered almost advisory. And the 15th Amendment, as we all know, is subject to all kinds of obstructive strategies like poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, what also needs to be noted is that while the 15th Amendment is genderless, women were not included. They did not receive voting rights. Now, the reason for this was pretty obvious, is that societally speaking, if women didn't have the right to vote before the amendments were ostensibly crafted for freed slaves, then they wouldn't have rights after the amendment. They wouldn't receive rights until 50 plus years later with the 19th Amendment. That's that one. Now, there is only one thing that separates the 15th Amendment from the 19th Amendment, only one word. And this points to an ongoing foundational workaround. And that is context and the lack of group specificity can translate into non-inclusion in new laws. To put it shortly, if you're not mentioned in it, then it doesn't have to apply to you. And that's what was going on with the 15th Amendment and voting rights for women. Didn't mention them, didn't include them. So what was the court doing during all this time? Well, it was following social norms. Now, there are several characteristics about the Supreme Court that need to be pointed out, in no particular order. One, the Supreme Court does not rule on morality. States will craft laws on that kind of behavior, and the courts then rule on how those laws affect constitutional rights. It's all about rights. The Supreme Court does not really make radical decisions. You won't find any rulings coming out that causes the country to make sharp 90-degree turns or to spin off of the taxes. They may play around the edges, but those are usually within societal tolerances. The Supreme Court has a fallback, a buffer, a safety valve, if you will, and that is states' rights. Any sensitive or complicated or complex issues, the Supreme Court can toss back and give the responsibility for decision-making to the states. You guys get to decide. And, if something comes up, maybe we'll decide on that. Now, the Supreme Court, there could be some debate about whether or not the Supreme Court is apolitical, but it is certainly not asocial. Justices come to the table with their own thoughts, their ideas, their agendas, their prejudices, their own experiences. And they certainly know that what their decision-making, how it can affect society. And this can cause over time some rather inconsistent rulings. A couple of an example of how the Supreme Court works and what it does are in two examples that had widespread long-term ramifications for society. 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. The Supreme Court looks at the 14th Amendment and in a 7-1 ruling rules that the segregation laws of the southern states are not unconstitutional. In effect, separate but equal is constitutional. Now, this ruling would usher in a period of massive discriminatory Jim Crow laws that would last for almost 60 years until 1954. The court at that time, using the 14th Amendment, would unanimously rule that separate but equal was unconstitutional. And this would serve to begin to dismantle those discriminatory laws, making for a better society. So since the 14th Amendment was the same, what was the difference? And that was the court and society at large. Now, if you look more closely at both of these rulings, the 1896 ruling technically is possibly the more accurate interpretation. The Supreme Court, the Constitution does not speak to separate but equal anything. It allows slavery. And so the court, looking at the 14th Amendment, and with the idea that separate but equal things, but two things that are separate can be equal, they looked at the 14th Amendment and said there was no problem, especially given the context of social norms. It was an intellectual conceit. Separate but equal is not unreasonable. The problem is that human societies can't do it. We have separate but equal is beyond our capability. Just can't do it. And so the 1954 court, looking at what had been going on for the last 60 years, because that's exactly what those 60 years proved, that it can't be done, looked at the 14th Amendment and said, pretty much discovered exactly what I just said, that the 14th Amendment was always going to be violated as long as it was separate but equal, and decided to rule on the aspirational intent of the Constitution, deciding that separate but equal was unconstitutional. So this shows what the courts can do depending on what they're looking at. And this brings us to Roe v. Wade. Let's see. There you go. Look, we'll go further down. There it is. Now, amid all of the flowery legalese and the relaying of details of history and precedent that explains the rulings, Roe v. Wade says two significant things, basically. The first of those is, of course, that women have the constitutional right to an abortion. Now, this isn't as radical as it sounds. First of all, the court was really giving back some of what had been taken almost a century before that. From the early 1700s to the mid 1800s, abortion had been legal, accessible, and available in this country. There was no moral stigma attached to it. Even the church thought that abortion was fine before the time of quickening, which was the time of the fetal movement. It wouldn't be until the mid 1850s that there would be pushback. And it wasn't because of any moral imperative, but for the usual boogeyman: money, power, and control. In the mid 1850s, the fledgling American Medical Association would start to make a move to make abortions illegal as a way of controlling medical practices and limiting competition for its doctors from midwives and homeopaths. Also at the time, with abortions primarily being used by middle and upper class white Protestant women, and the growing immigration population at that time, men and nativists felt that if whites were going to maintain control of the country, the birth rate needed to be kept up. Now, some could argue that that reasoning is still in play. So by 1880, abortions would be completely illegal in this country until Roe v. Wade. So the court was merely returning some of what had been taken with that portion of the rule. There was also a logic consistency here. The procedures for terminating an abortion are morally neutral. In fact, they've been used for decades for women's health for troublesome pregnancies. So one could question the logic of how a medical procedure that was specifically for women serving their health could be rendered unconstitutional for their use. There was no logic to making it unconstitutional. The second thing that came out of Roe v. Wade was more of a stipulation than an actual ruling. And that was the court stipulated that it was not endowing personhood onto the fetus. This too was fairly logical because no state in the country had bestowed personhood on the fetus. In fact, the courts found that the unborn had never been legally established as a person. So this view was and the state should have no more interest in a medical condition left it there, that would be fine, but that's not what they did. What they did was this. Recognizing a state of interest in prenatal life, the courts gave us the trimester guidelines. They walked the line, threaded the needle. This was their compromise. Now, when you look at these guidelines, the first question that popped into my mind was, well, let me read them first so we all know what I'm talking about. According to the guidelines, in the first trimester, the abortion decision and its effectuation must be left to the medical judgment of the woman's attending physician. In other words, women have the right to abort without undue interference from the state. That's first trimester, usually from 0 to about 13 weeks. Second trimester, from 14 to about 27 to 28 weeks, the state could adopt abortion restrictions reasonably related to maternal health. Now, in all honesty, I really don't know what that means, other than the states can become involved. Third trimester, the state's interest in the potentiality of human life would support prohibition of abortion so long as the law allowed exceptions for the life and health of the mother. And of course, what that means is that the states can ban abortion, except if it wants to consider the health of the life of maternal health. And so when you first look at those, my first question was, why does the state have any more interest in the potentiality of human life in the third trimester and not the first trimester? And this, of course, is the basis of the attitude toward the pro-life forces. There's actually they're right, there's no legal reason that this potentiality should only be the third trimester. It's potential at the beginning of conception. And this brought up the question of the observation that what it seems to say and do is different from what it actually does. Now, what it seems to say is that states have limits. There are boundaries around what they can do. And if you accept that the state has an interest in this, then yeah, that would be correct. But it also does several other things. First of all, the very existence of these guidelines practically invite the states to intervene. It also gives them the way to do that and mask their true agenda. And that is behind maternal health. And they're certainly taking advantage of that. These guidelines also imply that that pregnant women are irresponsible. And any state that adopts the guidelines is saying just that. We can't trust pregnant women to make decisions about their pregnancy, so we have to do it. We have to get involved, and this is what we're saying. The guidelines empower states through their own self-interest to consistently erode the rights of pregnant women to the point to where they can intervene egregiously and make decisions that affect job opportunities, income, health, relationships, their entire futures, even if that involvement has a negative impact on their lives. The states can also deny a legal medical treatment to a pregnant woman and for her condition. Now, it gets even more concerning after that and demonstrates why the stipulation became necessary. In putting down these guidelines, particularly the third trimester guideline, what the Supreme Court did was give the fetus agency through the states. In the third trimester, the fetus has parity as far as the state's concerned, and decisions are now made based on the state's determination, not the woman's. And so it has given the fetus agency, legal agency through the states. What has also happened is since it has agency now, the states can decide, can treat it as a person because it now has parity with the mother's rights. And in being able to give it parity, what has been created is a legal non-person status that hasn't existed since slavery. The state gets to treat the fetus as a person without having to bestow any rights on it at all, which is reminiscent of exactly what the 3/5 compromise was. States can count you as a person, but you have no rights under the Constitution. And that's what we have here. And this makes the stipulation even more important because there's actually a clever and logical reason to have to do that. And this is why codifying Roe v. Wade into federal law would be an error because it would establish a second-class status for women. Your rights can be diminished by the state because of your condition. Now, let's talk about some of the fear that the pro-choice advocates have. And those usually boil down to a couple of things. Yeah, those two things. Overturning Roe v. Wade and courts granting fetus personhood. Now, let's start with overturning Roe v. Wade because, well, that's the title. Overturning Roe v. Wade is not likely to happen. And the reason for that is besides, other than a principle, there's no strategic reason. There's no strategic advantage whatsoever to completely overturn Roe. To do that, they would create a vacuum that needed to be filled. It would galvanize not only pro-choice advocates, but those moderates around the edge that don't necessarily agree with Roe, but think that something should still be in existence as having choice. So you put those two forces together. You have also, in overturning Roe v. Wade completely, is left legislators who really don't want to get involved in this or really don't care about the issue, no cover. So it is more advantageous to gut it or render it ineffective than to completely overturn it. In so doing, you kind of create less of a target. You do exactly what's going on with voting rights right now. Creating less of a target, but what you leave there is basically nothing anyone can actually do with. And the legislatures that are tepid about it can give you the Joe Manchin reasoning. The law is still in existence, so certainly it will continue to protect women. And so this gives them a little more flexibility and potency. There's no reason that they need to overturn this law, because it's much more powerful to just kind of set their piecemeal. And so the fear-inducing terminology of overturning Roe v. Wade needs to be replaced with something probably a little less fearsome. And that is the gutting of Roe v. Wade, or the rendering Roe v. Wade ineffectual. And strategies can be crafted around a partial existence of Roe, as well as answering the question, should states be allowed to intervene so egregiously in a woman's medical condition? Now, the second fear is courts granting fetus personhood. That's even less likely to happen than overturning Roe v. Wade. And there are a couple of portions, the answer to this comes in two parts. First part is the law. Now, I know there's always talk about fetal personhood, and a couple of states have tried to do it and whatnot, but they probably discovered what I'm about to tell you. And it is absolutely clear, this is unambiguous. The moment the fetus gets personhood, then it is entitled to all the rights and privileges and benefits under the Constitution. But what that also means is that it has the limits under the Constitution as well. And as all state laws will agree, the Constitution actually confers, and we all feel in our hearts, one person's rights cannot adversely affect another person's rights. My rights end where your rights begin. That's what the law says. That's what we've all accepted. It's what the Constitution says. So the moment the fetus has the rights of a person, the woman is perfectly entitled to say, that person is interfering with my rights, and those rights will only be more greatly affected as time goes on. Please remove it. Get it out of my house. And she is entitled to have that remedied under the law. That's what it says. Because if she doesn't have that, and it is decided that one person's rights can subvert another person's rights, then what exactly does that say? You can extrapolate that straight on down the line. Some other person's rights is more important than mine. Well, rich guy needs a kidney, you're a match, you only need one, we're taking it. Right now, my blood can't even be tested for anyone's advantage without my wanting to do it. So it certainly can't strap me to a table and take a pint. To subvert someone else's rights for the benefit of another person is enslavement. You become a slave to that person. And we have a whole 13th Amendment that pretty much says you can't do that. So if the fetus becomes a person under the law, it can't interfere with the woman's rights, and the woman has the right to say, you can't interfere. So please take it out. In a very real sense, although it's counterintuitive, the fetus attaining personhood is actually a benefit to the pro-choice advocates. That's just the law. So the second part, and why this will never happen, is institutions. Every age-related institution in the country starts at live birth and the development of the person from live birth. So what they will have to do is readjust for the now amorphous dates of conception. So now, what is the age for getting into college? Starting kindergarten, military service. What's the age of adulthood? Driver's license, getting married, owning property, on and on and on and on and on. This has a ripple effect through all age-related institutions and beyond that. It will affect federal and state tax laws. because at that point, when the fetus is now a person, every pregnant woman, rich or poor, married or single, now is eligible for child tax benefits. And it doesn't even matter whether or not she has a miscarriage because she has had a dependent during that calendar year. Now, such a thing has the potential to cost the government hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in tax revenue. On top of that, if such a thing could happen, it lends itself to abuse. A woman gets pregnant, a few weeks later has a miscarriage, and she still gets the tax benefits. And with the possibilities of that kind of abuse, well, now every miscarriage has to be investigated, costing the institutions more money. And now, of course, they have even more of an interest in seeing that pregnancies come to term, and thus maybe find it beneficial, if you will, to ensure gynecological care, more monetary expenditures. No one wants to deal with that chaos. So between the laws saying what they do and the institutions having been affected by it, that's not likely to happen. It never has before, and it hasn't happened to this date. So if that's your fear, that it's not going to happen. Now, if we overall look at this, what we can understand is that if the laws were consistent, then the status of the fetus doesn't make any difference. It is completely irrelevant. If the fetus is not a person, then its pregnancy is a medical condition, and the state should have no more interest in that medical condition than any other. Woman is between her doctor, she and her doctor. If the fetus is a person, well, under the law, its rights can't interfere with the woman's rights, and she can have it removed. That's it in either case. Fetal status is irrelevant. So what strategies can we have to get to that kind of autonomy? Well, there's certainly plenty of information on the internet. All I have to do is Google it, and there are all kinds of strategies and things that are there. Usually protesting and kind of getting involved at the grassroots level. You can contact your local NARAL office, and they certainly have ways for you to get involved and whole lists of things and people you can contact. Another strategy is pretty simple that everybody in this room and anyone listening can do. Don't vote for Republicans. Do not do it. I don't care what they look like, what they say, how old or young they are, does not matter. Moderates are in lockstep with conservatives. Do not vote for Republicans. Tell your families, tell your friends, it is just that simple. Their platform is absolutely against reproductive rights. So don't do it. It's just that simple, if you just need a simple strategy. Put them out of office for 10 or 20 years until they settle down and become more sane, and then do what you will. But do not vote for Republicans. The IRA, the Equal Rights Amendment, is a strategy that some depend on to solve this problem. Well, if history is any example at all, usually laws or policies or amendments that have been crafted to address a single group's issues are worked around. And as far as the ERA is concerned, there are other problems. When Roe v. Wade was ruled and the galvanizing of the pro-life and conservative factions, the movement for the ERA lost some steam and stalled. Recently, it regained its momentum somewhat and has the necessary number of states to be ratified, but the issue still is that it has passed its deadline. And the idea out there is that if the ERA comes up, it will wind up in litigation because of that. So experts are looking at the ERA coming up, if at all, 10 years down the road. So are there any other strategies? Well, yeah, which is why I'm standing here. The strategy is to reimagine the issue. What has to happen right now? The image in women's rights on this issue is women versus babies. And, more detrimentally, irresponsible, selfish women killing babies. And it's a powerful image. Emotions level the playing field. What needs to happen is a page needs to be taken out of the conservative playbook. Women's issues and this issue needs to be presented as a people's issue. And why is that? Well, one of the reasons is, look at what happens with gun control. You can barely get anything passed. And it's not because it's presented as an issue for gun rights owners. It is presented as an attack on the people's right to bear arms. And very effectively. I don't care about it because I got no gun, but there you have it. It's the people's rights. Also, there's a history of law and policy that that says one thing, but we understand and accept to mean something else. The original Constitution, as crafted by the framers, is genderless. There is nothing in it that says men have these rights and women have these rights. What it says is citizens and talks about the people's rights. However, what we understand is that, well, they weren't really talking about people, they were talking about white males. They were the only ones that had the benefit of all the rights in the Constitution. And so that's how it was kind of accepted. And that's how we've kind of played this out. No laws, no amendments, no policies have ever really been crafted to bestow rights on white males. We certainly had them, well, there's a 14th Amendment and to bestow equal protection for Black people. We had the 15th Amendment to bestow voting rights, the same. Women needed their own amendment for voting rights in the 19th. Heck, gay people needed the courts to rule that they could get married. So every group seems to have their rights established like some kind of door prize, some kind of prize that they have earned. With white males, don't have to do this because we already assume that they have these rights. And we need to quit allowing that as a default. And so the issue is that women's rights, reproductive rights, needs to be about people. It's the people's rights that are in jeopardy here. And how does reproductive rights translate into that? Well, it says it in the guidelines. What it says is that the state has an interest. But we remember that the fetus doesn't have any rights under the law, and so the pregnancy is legally a medical condition. So essentially what they're saying is that the state has an interest in a medical condition of a person. And that since it has this interest, it can involve itself, it can intervene to the point to where it can interfere with that person's rights and that person's decision-making. Even if it has a negative impact on their job opportunity, income, health, relationships, their entire lives. The state can become involved because of that person's medical condition. It can also involve itself to the point to where that person cannot get treatment for that medical condition. So let's expand that just a little. If the state has an interest in the person who has the condition, well, of course, the state must have an interest in the person who caused the condition. So the woman points to the guy and says, he's the one. Then the state, of course, goes say, we have an interest in finding out if you caused this medical condition. We're going to have you tested. We can do that. Why? Well, since we can certainly interfere with the rights of the person who has the condition, we can interfere with the rights of the person who has caused the condition. So roll up your sleeve. Or let's flip it. There's a pandemic going on. The state certainly has the rights of the lives of its citizens, but there are people walking around who are unvaccinated or being irresponsible. Well, the state now has the right, since there's a medical condition going on, to say, well, you may have this medical condition and we have an interest. So we're going to test you. Doesn't matter whether you want to be tested or not. We can do that because we've got an interest. And if you're tested, or if you refuse to be tested, we now have the right to impede your life and impact your life, even if it's a negative impact of job opportunities, income, health, relationships, your entire life. We can do that because that says so. So unless you have something done, house arrest. Because we have an interest in the lives of the people, and we can egregiously involve ourselves in medical decisions. And that's the people's rights. This is what they can do. Now, that's a slippery slope argument, of course, but it is not actually really outrageous because everything I've described has happened in this country on some level or another. I mean, we certainly know that states are more than willing, if you leave a legal crack in the door, that they will kick it open and come through. They're doing it with voting rights. They've been doing it with Roe v. Wade for decades. There was a time in this country that Blacks could not access certain medical care. If you didn't have a Black doctor or a Black hospital, and it was only a white one, and you needed medical care, well, good luck. Because by law, you weren't going to get any service at that hospital. The government incarcerated Japanese Americans just because of the way they looked. So the slippery slope argument I've just given here is not preposterous. So the women's issues need to be presented at every level as people's issues, people's rights. In literature, in media, in the streets, and certainly in the courts. Because that's what the Constitution talks about. And we've got to make the Constitution mean what it says, not the default. And the argument of women's rights coming as people's rights, or any group coming as people's rights, is that it's bulletproof. No one is going to walk out there and say, you know what, I'd love it if the state got involved in my medical decisions and make all the decisions possible, even though I don't want them to, and of course, impede my ability to get the treatment I may want. To the point to where they can interfere and do damage to my entire life. Sure, I'd love that. Let them get involved. No one's going to say that, I don't think. And so the argument would be bulletproof. And that's the strategy I think that needs to happen. The women's rights presented as people's rights. Because as the content says, to mean what it says, we have to insist that the court decides on the aspirational nature of the Constitution and what we all believe that it's supposed to mean. That it's all about people. And I think we would all agree in this room that women are people. Thank you. Certainly.
All right, thank you very much. We're going to have some questions and answers, if you're okay with that.
Sure.
We have an issue in that one of our microphones has died. So what I'm going to ask, Solomon, if you would, repeat the question of the speaker for the benefit of the Zoom audience. And I'll walk around with this so they can hear
Okay.
questions and stuff. If you all can just sort of, when you ask your question, talk really loud, that would work. But if not, Solomon can repeat it, not only for the Zoom audience, but because we can do the Zoom audience here, actually, but for the benefit of people in the room. So, before we get started with questions, please, number one, raise your hand. Two, wait for the speaking stick. Ask only one question at a time. And we're gonna have to try to make sure everybody gets a chance to ask the question before we go around again to repeat questions for a person. Okay? So the podium is yours. Well, we're also at this time going to, if I can get an system. So, our society is an all volunteer organization. We receive no money from any other organization. We survive due to your commitment to our common goals. So we pass the baskets. Thank you in advance for your generous donations. All right, Mike, I think you have your hand up.
Be just lower from first trimester to something like really short? Did I hear that right?
I do not know. I know what's going on is with Texas. She's nodding, so I'm assuming she knows. But I understand there are a series of states that are,
6 or 8 weeks.
yeah.
They were saying it was before someone, I didn't even know that.
So they get.
Yeah, I thought that was also in the Texas law as
So
well.
that worked. That's legal, yes?
Not yet.
But that's what they're trying to do.
They're trying to do it.
It's gonna be before it's important.
Okay, thank you. But technically, they could lower it to 6 weeks.
Technically, they
They
can.
can do whatever they want.
Okay,
But as I said, without fetal personhood, actually, it has no rights. And so the idea would be is that should be irrelevant. Honestly, if it's not a person and it has no rights, then it's a medical condition that should be served by a doctor and patient, because that's what the states do for every other medical condition. The legal question becomes, how can they so egregiously involve themselves in this medical condition and no other medical condition in their entire state for men, for example? And it would seem to me, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg also utilized this, and I would agree, is that under the 14th Amendment and equal protection, well, how can you cherry pick just a medical condition that affects women and egregiously interfere with their rights to decision making?
My question really would require a longer answer, but as a father, I find it interesting that nowhere in this presentation have fathers been mentioned, and nothing about any say-so whatsoever. Yet the fetus is genetically a mixture of both parents, and that's why I don't consider it the same thing as a finger. So I don't know if there's any way of including fathers in the. I sit here so many times, innocent women and children, well, they're innocent fathers too, innocent this. So is there any role, especially if you make it a people's issue rather than a woman's issue, for any participation whatsoever of fathers in this?
Well, yeah, that's exactly what. If I understand it correctly, is he's asking if there's any way to have the fathers represented in this issue. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't say overwhelm the other person's power, but it's not mentioned anywhere. I think it should say a woman's doctor and her God or something. And I know there's not going to be a situation where the father would have any more or veto, for example, but why not think about fathers at least?
Oh, okay. He's questioning fathers' involvement in this issue, if I understand correctly. I partially approached that in my slippery slope argument. The thing is fathers aren't in this issue because, in a sense, they never have been, I don't disagree with you that men should be held to the same responsibility of women, but our society just doesn't do that. They look at it as a men's issue because women are responsible for carrying the fetus. I started to kind of compare this with what states are doing to the analogy of a guy that gets a woman pregnant and then disappears, runs off. Your responsibility now, I'm not doing anything about that. And that feels like what the states themselves are doing. We're going to make you bring that baby here, but we're not going to do anything that's going to help you. It's all up to you now. We'll get it here, but our hands are off by that time. And so as far as making, I mean, there are laws that can certainly do that, I suppose. You know, it's difficult to get the fathers to get child support. And states put very little effort behind that to consistently say, you need to help support the child that you brought in here. And so honestly, there seems to be no real solution because they're not involved to begin with. The only real solution is that you eliminate it from being a woman's issue, is my argument here. And you make it a people's issue. And in that way, men become involved. It's no longer women versus babies. It's now all about people and people's rights.
I question your argument about the establishing personhood of the fetus makes a difference in terms of how that would protect the women's rights, because then you're talking killing is murder. And if abortion would be murdering a person, if you ended the viability of the fetus, and it would be like, okay, your kid annoys you and you know, you get rid of him. I just don't see that as something that would protect the woman.
Did everybody get that? Her question is that she debates the premise that a fetal personhood protects the woman because the idea, and I've heard the argument before, the idea is that to remove the fetus is killing a person, that you're actively killing someone. And so, and it's an argument I've heard before. I would say that the law doesn't care. The law does not, I mean, one, because the fetus cannot survive without diminishing the rights of the woman, the law says that that doesn't matter. The rights of the person who is being harmed, which is the woman, has to say so. That's the priority between those two priorities. I would also look at the life is sacrosanct argument. I mean, the history of human beings is a bloody mosaic of just extinguishing lives because of ideology. Well, just look at our society. The child poverty rate, infant mortality, the inadequate schools, poverty in itself. There are children involved in all of these things. And so to say that at this point, we're going to deny women rights because, well, we got the rights of the fetus who's now a person involved is a bit hypocritical. I understand the position and the difficulty that one can legally parse that. But I would say that given that balance, by and large, the law always chooses on the persons whose rights are being intervened or diminished, and kind of always has. Now, yeah, it's an ugly thing to imagine. Honestly speaking, if you really want to diminish this issue, you have, you know, a robust sex education and accessible birth control. But in lieu of those responsible measures, then you leave this with this balance of, well, yeah, if you remove it, but it's not the woman's fault that it can't survive outside the body.
Solomon, for states who don't want to have abortion in their states, can't they just make all abortion clinics illegal? So if they don't have any doctors performing, or are we going back to the illegal?
Well, interestingly enough, I think that comes up against the guidelines. I think there have been attempts to do just that in a roundabout way, where there was a ruling, and it might be Texas again, I forget, that doctors needed privileges at a regular hospital. And you couldn't, and they found out that there wasn't a lot of that going around. And it went to the Supreme Court. And interestingly enough, the Supreme Court, or the court ruled that no, that's too much interference. That we have decided that the doctor does not need those rights, and the only reason this rule exists is to eliminate abortion in your state, and that's not allowed under Roe v. Wade.
I just have a quick, there are two comments, but you can come back to me for the second one. The first one, if I could just humor and argue for the personhood, as a woman thinking about it, if as soon as I could conceive that my fetus has personhood, there were a lot of government things that I probably pursue in protection of my child. And I think too, like you were saying earlier, with fathers who are absent, I could easily see a case coming to say, okay, he's not here, but in the protection of the child, we're going to go ahead and go to court, even though I may only be 10 weeks pregnant, and start getting child support.
Correct. And that's exactly, and I said that.
Right. And I agree, because that's what I'm thinking. Like, I feel like, yes, there are two sides to it with being a person. Yes, there's this thought of, you may be killing a person. But then on the other side, there is an empowerment behind that for women to say and take that and say, I deserve rights. I deserve these rights. We have folks who, and in looking at it as a medical condition, when you, if anyone ever has kidney failure and becomes a dialysis patient, the state and the federal government come together and cover you with insurance. They make sure that you're able to get to dialysis. They make sure that you're able to get the medical treatment that you need for your kidney disease. So in essence, if this is a person that I'm carrying, then they deserve all those rights as well. So
I also mentioned that as gynecological care to get it here. And I think it would be an expenditure and that they really don't want to do.
This is just a quick comment. I fully agree with you that it is a people's question, right, and not women's right. But the root of this thing is actually in the 14th and 15th Amendment, which both of them talk about citizens and persons, but women were not the persons or citizens. And as we have seen it,
yes, absolutely correct. Which is, what you're saying is that the 14th and 15th Amendment didn't cover women, and that's absolutely true.
And that is the root of the whole
and
thing.
So, and that goes back to my finishing point, is that in this day and age, we understand who people are. No one's going to walk into court and argue that, well, that woman isn't really a person, so she should not be covered under the 14th Amendment, and so the fetus should get top priority. I don't think you'll ever hear that argument. And so since we do realize that we're all people, then it makes more of a difficult argument. As I said, apparently Ruth Bader Ginsburg, made that point and got a number of things understood based on the 14th Amendment. I've always been an advocate and a questioner of why isn't abortion essentially a 14th Amendment issue, equal protection under the law, since it's not, a person. And no lawyer has ever been able to answer that question. It was argued somewhat in this last case with Texas. She argued about equal protection, but she argued in the case of liberty. And I believe that's only half the story, honestly. I would like to see the argument that you're asking the states to be involved in something that has no rights, to the point where you're diminishing the decision-making and rights of a person who does have rights. And how does that factor into the 14th Amendment? But nobody ever makes that argument, as far as I can tell. Because I think, as with the point of murdering babies goes, no one wants to legally step on that third rail, which is why you almost never hear about, well, the fetus is not a person under the law. Why is it getting all of this attention? Now, there are some that will say it in private, but you almost never hear the argument in public because it makes people uncomfortable.
I recently heard a seminar of a panel of reproductive rights lawyers, including one who had argued before the Supreme Court one of the abortion issues. And they agreed that it isn't a matter of whether Roe versus Wade will be overruled, it's when. And it may not happen in this June on the Mississippi case, because I mean, the justices are political, and it would be bad for Republicans to have the issue so blatant at that point until at least after the midterm elections. But it will happen eventually. And the fact is, at present, a number of states are ready to make abortion illegal the minute that happens. And it's already happened to some extent in Texas. So regardless of the legal niceties, and I think you're very logical about if the fetus is not, has no personhood, what's the reason for regulating a medical condition? Well, they're not listening to that. All the states had laws against abortion until the 1960s, some with some exceptions, but it's been that way in the past, and it could be that way in the future. As I see the future, I think that will happen. However, what's different now is that you can buy pills over the internet, and that's, women are beginning to understand how to do that. It's perfectly feasible, and it's going to be more and more common. There are many other countries historically where abortion was illegal, but became very common and very accepted, and then they changed the law. And I can see that happening in this country in some states where the conservatives want it to be illegal. There are even some anti-abortion people who really don't want to put women in jail or make it impossible for them to have abortions under many circumstances. What they want is a moral statement that it's wrong. And as long as the law says that, some of them don't really care if abortions occur. Now, there are a lot who are actually quite adamant about it and would try to enforce the law. So you couldn't count on that. But I see a time when it gets to be fairly common to have what are illegal abortions, probably in most places not prosecuted, occasionally prosecuted, and eventually the law is changing. I also see a pro-choice backlash against these laws, and places where the pro-choice group has had little power, or people haven't cared too much, are suddenly going to realize, oh, we're actually losing this right, and that they'll become more active politically, and the laws may not be as restrictive as they seem right now.
I'm going to push back on that a little bit, largely because we don't see that for voting rights. And the reason we don't see that for voting rights is that it makes it more difficult to mount a campaign to do anything about it. As we found in this political climate, they've completely pretty much gutted voting rights, and the states are doing whatever they want, but they can't get anything done about it. And so you don't have to deal with that kind of backlash because the law is still on the books. So what are you fighting against? And legislators can say it's still there. And so I don't think Roe will be overturned because it gives it that kind of protection, that they're smart enough to say, we're going to make the guidelines more flexible or eliminate the guidelines is what's going to happen. They're going to, that's what they will probably do. And interestingly enough, the problem actually isn't the guidelines. The guidelines are a response to the real problem. The real problem is that first line. The courts recognize the state's interest in prenatal life. That is the dangerous line. Because the question becomes, should the states have that kind of interest? It's a medical condition by law. And that's the question that has to be actually answered by everyone, even the law itself. The courts need to answer that. But nobody is putting that out there. And so my view is, and what you described is unfortunately the usual pendulum swing that's been going on. Well, you get one side that wins and puts legislatures in. This is the problem with the American system. It bends to absorb dissidents. So you get enough people on this side, and then the system bends to in that direction, which means you get a backlash from this side. And so it bends back to address these people, and then you get a backlash from this side, and so on and so forth and so on. The strategy here is to eliminate that by presenting the issue in such a way that no one can argue against it. And legally, you can do that, where women don't have to necessarily hide and order pills from overseas, or sneak into areas or get surreptitious information as to how they can get things done, essentially pushing it back to the 50s and 60s. The idea here is to eliminate that for a greater aspiration, that should be the strategy. Not a holding pattern. The idea is to completely change the dialogue so you don't get this pendulum swing, because we know the truth of it is. I mean, the laws say so. The attitudes of the country say so. People have rights. We have the rights to our bodies. You and I, they can't come in and take any part of our body. Can't use a single lick of it. Not a single drop of blood can they take from you without your permission. Unless you're a prisoner or you're in the military, but that's not what we're talking about here. And if they can't do that to us, why should that be allowed for any woman? And so the demand here is that it needs to, if we're looking at equality, then the strategy needs to be about eliminating that pendulum swing.
Yeah, Solomon, I have a question specifically about the 13th and 15th Amendments. So would you be able to scroll back to those? And while you're on your way there, I want to mention that as of this past week in North Carolina, birth control pills and contraceptive patches can be bought without a prescription in a pharmacy.
That's nice.
Yeah. Vote Democrat.
Yeah.
Okay, so in the 13th Amendment, it mentions punishment for crime, which is a type of servitude, involuntary servitude.
Right.
15th Amendment, states shall not deny
shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or
Yeah.
previous
So,
condition of
okay,
servitude.
so
Whoa.
in 2016, Florida changed to allow former ex-convicts to vote. Until 2016, they could not, but that didn't apply in 2016. That was for the next time. So was the state of Florida, and I don't know how many other states don't allow ex-convicts to vote. So aren't they violating the 15th Amendment right there?
It would appear so. Based on what we're reading here. But what we also know, and it's another reason for the strategy, is that the history is loaded with Supreme Court interpretations that are inconsistent, that the amendments are worked around. However they manage to do that, if not completely ignored. It goes back to my first statement. And yeah, I didn't notice that because I was concentrating on other things, but yeah. I'm surprised no one has argued that.
Yeah. Solomon, thank you for your presentation. It's very good. I think you're in danger of minimizing some of the passion and the strength of some theology. You mentioned a lot about the guidelines and so forth, a lot of which maybe predate Roe versus Wade, maybe led to Roe versus Wade. But these people are trying to get rid of it. When they do that, a lot of these guidelines will go with it. For instance, in Alabama, they passed the law that if Roe versus Wade is overturned, there'll be a penalty of 92 years for having an abortion or causing an abortion. I think from what I've read and heard, they, or at least a strong minority, mean it. And I think that if Roe versus is overturned, I'm not saying it will be. Maybe I agree. Maybe it's less likely than they'll probably work around it. If Roe versus Wade goes down, they won't stop. They'll be going after birth control. They don't like birth control either. Basically, it's about sex, and people are very irrational about that. And I think they won't stop. They'll take what they can get, and I think they mean it. And a lot of others, if the Roe versus Wade goes down, a lot of those things, guidelines, guardrails, and so forth, may go with it.
It could be argued that those guardrails have already kind of fallen. For the length of Roe v. Wade, states have been eroding it. It's been death by 1,000 cuts. Before this case went to the Supreme Court, most of the abortion clinics in Texas were already gone through regulations. And that has happened throughout a number of states where they've crafted laws because they've got the second guideline. As it said, the second guideline, the states can adopt abortion restrictions reasonably related to maternal health. The state can adopt abortion restrictions. And that's what they've been using. They've been regulating the clinics. They first separate the clinics from a regular hospital, and then they regulate the wazoo out of them as much as they can get away with. So it can be argued that those guidelines already, honestly, the guidelines only say one thing. It says that women can have the right to an abortion for 13 weeks. That's effectively what it says, that there's no interference. I am it occurred to me, amusingly enough, is that if an abortion clinic decided, well, we're only going to do first trimester abortions, well, it seems to me under the law, then they don't need the state to regulate, the state can't regulate the facilities. Now, that was just an amusing thought that came to my head based on the guidelines here. I don't know if any clinic did it or what would happen if they tried to do that, but I amused myself with that idea. Once again, the guidelines are problematic only because of the opening statement. The recognition, the courts, even subsequent courts, tend to believe that the state can give itself, and this is what it is, the state gives itself an interest in this condition. And the idea is that's okay. Now, I would argue that it's not okay. Why does the state have this interest? I mean, realistically speaking, why does the state have an interest in prenatal life? One assumes it has the interest, it should have interest in the life of all of its citizens. So why is it stipulating this specifically? This should go without saying, but they said it. And the restrictions related to maternal health. Well, one of the reasons that Texas lost its case was also proven that you do realize that the regulations for any hospital already falls within these, that abortion clinics don't need any more regulations because the standard regulation for treating people already exists and have existed for decades. But there it is. And what does it do? It invites the states to apply more regulations for abortion clinics than it does for hospitals. And that's what they did. So I understand the argument and the fear of losing the guidelines. But I would also argue that they're pretty much lost anyway, which is why we're in fear of which is why many people are in fear of what's happening with the Supreme Court. Better to start from scratch, if you will. I mean, in a way, it'd be better if they just overturned the whole law. That means people will be galvanized to go in there and actually do what should have been done over the last 50 years. And that gives women total autonomy over what happens to their bodies, because the guidelines actually are useless. There is no reason for those guidelines other than a compromise. They're actually kind of irrelevant. And the reason they're irrelevant is because women don't wait till the 3rd trimester to abort. That's a fantasy. No healthy pregnancy is aborted in its 3rd trimester. And there are a couple of actually practical good reasons for that. One, it then becomes a medical procedure, which means that it's surgery and you need a team, and that makes it more expensive. Emotionally, I don't know that there are many women waiting around and going up to 8 months, and they may feel like they want the baby to come now because understandably it's on their bladder, but they're not looking at it and saying, you know what, I'm done here, take it out. They're not doing that. And there's no record of that ever happening. So these guidelines are actually rather useless. They simply serve the purpose of giving states power.
We're gonna have to wrap up. Mike really wants.
How about rights?
Quick question.
Well, Dorothy
Can
had her
Jehovah's
hand up and she hadn't
Witnesses-
spoken yet. Oh, okay.
Did you have?
Can JH people deny transfusions to their kids? That's right.
Can who?
Jehovah's Witnesses. JH people.
Not necessarily. I know in instances in the hospital, if the physician danger, there are times when they can override that and actually get like child protective services involved. It gets really complicated, but there's a lot of gray. Just say it like that.
We need to wrap up.
We're gonna go ahead and save this child's life. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. We're gonna have to wrap up. Dorothy, did I miss you? No. I apologize. Let's give.
Thank you, everybody.
Turn off your lavalier and. All right, thank you very much. Wow, that was, I think, a very definitely thought-provoking discussion. And, thank you so much. So we'll move on to finish up our program. Does anybody have any announcements today? Dorothy.
I just want to remind folks of the Change for Change jar. Please consider contributing to Snowville. It's arrived next summer.
For those of you at home on the Zoom, Dorothy was reminding us of Change for Change. So feel free to email in your contributions. Any other announcements? Jan?
There's a couple of AEU events coming up next week that you can sign in for. And there's a workshop on fighting racism. I think there's a couple of episodes of that. That's Monday night and requires pre-registration. And then on Wednesday night, there's a follow-up discussion on criminal justice. And the idea is getting a group together that's going to discuss ways to fight criminal injustice and maybe come up with some practical suggestions for actions.
Right, thank you. Laura. Presumably not upcoming programs.
Yes, we're going to be joining the Ethical Society of Northern Westchester next week for our Zoom meeting. So instead of our normal time at 1:30. It will be at 11 a.m. They're doing an annual Darwin Day talk with Holly Moore, Carl Romano, and Milt Steinberg. And they're going to talk about their lives as scientists and so forth. And with the weekly email, you'll get the link for that. But more importantly, the week after that, our next live meeting, Sunday, February 20th, our own Mike Conrad is going to be doing a Darwin Day talk in person. So we're really looking forward to that.
All right, thank you. Any other?
They're giving away free N95 face masks at some places. Does anyone know where those places are?
So the question was about N95. If people have advice. Yes, I think some drugstores and so forth, but yeah. All right. Next up, we're going to have closing words. Jay, it's all yours. And if you could hold the speaking stick for the Zoom audience.
It's like my staff makes me feel important. I'm going to close with what some famous women have had to say about parenting. As I said, it all comes back to that. Irma Bombeck said, "When my kids become wild and unruly, I use a nice, safe playpen. When they settle down, I come out of it." Reese Witherspoon said, "I always say, if you aren't yelling at your kids, you're not spending enough time with them." Carrie Underwood reflected, quote, "The majority of my diet is made up of foods that my kids didn't finish." And Phyllis Diller famously said, "I want my children to have all the things I couldn't afford. Then I want to move in with them." And finally, a little humor about mom. A young police recruit was asked during his final exam, "What would you do if you had to arrest your own mother?" He quickly answered, "Call for backup."
Right. Our meeting is over, but our fellowship continues. Please give a warm greeting to the person sitting next to you with a smile and a kind word. Due to the pandemic, maintain social distancing and be considerate of the health and welfare of others. Thank you all for coming. We can mill around for a little while. That I don't know, but one of them's out of juice. This one is dead. The battery's dead. They gave us a dead battery. So we ought to let them know somehow, but I don't know how to do that. Yeah, he had to leave. He had a precinct meeting. This is a mic bucket that says mics, but that one is dead.